Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am going to cover a short course of wound management that will be helpful for every allied health professional. We all suffer any or every type of wound in our daily routine, like from simple burn in the kitchen, from simple prick of the needle, and from simple cut of the knife. But to provide the basic or appropriate management of that respective wound, we need to understand the basic anatomy of the wound, and for basic physiology, the wound involved tissues and ultimately the wound healing process. And finally we will discuss about the basic wound types that is usually we witness in our daily routine. So this is our first lecture, which will cover the basic anatomy of the wound. To understand the basic anatomy of the wound, we need to get back the basic anatomy of our body. We all know that basic unit of our body is made up of cell, and different cells stack together and form a tissue. And these tissues layer up and form an organ, and this organ is by part of an organ system, and this organ systems together make up an individual or an organism. From the second example, we will discuss it in more precisely, like from small intestine, which is an organ. This is the cell of a small intestine, and these cells are stacked up and form a tissue, which is by definition group of lining cells, and these group of lining cells stack together and form an organ, which is known as small intestine. And small intestine is part of an organ system which is made up of large intestine, stomach, pancreas, and which is also known as digestive system. And this digestive system is part of an organism which is we are human beings. So this is to know the basic anatomy of the wound, we need to understand the basic anatomy of our body. And we all know that basic unit of our body is made up of cell, and these cells stacked up and form a tissue. So whenever there is a damage to the body or a damage to the skin, it means that there is a damage to the tissue or damage to the extracellular matrix. I repeat it, whenever there is a damage to the skin, it means that there is a damage to the skin tissue or extracellular matrix. Because if it is a skin, like epidermis, top layer of the skin, epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. So whenever there is any injury, like from simple cut of a knife to the epidermis of the skin, the epithelial tissue gets damaged, and there is a damage to the epithelial tissue and then to the extracellular matrix. So this is the basic definition of the wound, like discontinuity in the normal structure of the tissue or extracellular matrix. And in another definition, an injury to the living tissue. In any or every type of wound, on the tissue gets damaged. An injury to the living tissue caused by accident, violent surgery, or due to some chronic diseases. And by anatomically, the definition of the wound is external or internal breakdown in the normal continuity of the extracellular matrix. So the basic definition of the wound is based on injury to the living tissue. Whenever there is a damage to the tissue due to any reason, it means that there is a wound at that respective area. And that is the basic definition of the wound. So to understand this, we need to know the type of the tissues. Basically, there are four type of tissues in our body. The outermost layer of our body is covered with epithelial tissue. The connective tissue which connects our body, the connective tissue, which is made up of tendons, cartilages, smooth and elastic fibers, and these fibers are actually connected with each other in our body. After the connective tissue, there is our muscular tissue that provide tensile strength to our body, like cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and skeletal muscles. And finally, the nervous tissue, which is made up of brain and spinal cord, which is used for communication and transporting messages in our body. So basically, there are four type of tissues in our body, and whenever there is a damage to the body body due to any external surgery, violence, accident, chemical burn, then obviously there is damage to the any of the four involved tissues. We will understand the basic anatomy of the wound with a simple definition of the burn wound. Like in any kind of the burn, for example, in this picture, this is a superficial burn, and in this burn there is a damage to the epidermis. Epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. So basically, in this wound there is a damage to the epithelial tissue. Simply, in another example, this is a diabetic wound, and there is a damage to the epithelial tissue as well as and then connective tissue as well, which is present in our dermis. Basically, three layers of the skin: epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. Epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue, and dermis is made up of connective tissue. Connective tissue means elastic fibers, smooth fibers, collagens and blood vessels as well. So in this diabetic wound, there is damage to the epithelial tissue as well as connective tissue fibers. And if this wound gets deep into the our plantar aspect of our feet, then there is damage to the muscles. Ultimately, the wound will lose its tensile strength as well as damage to the bone. This is our basic structure of the skin. The skin is made up of epidermis, which is this blue line, and this pink area. This blue line is basically the top layer of the epidermis, which is made up of epithelial tissue. Basically, there are 5 layers of the epidermis, and from these junctions, or from this dermoepidermal junction, the dermis gets started from this brownish curve to this deep brown line, and this yellow is actually the fat, and these are muscles which lie behind the fatty layer of the skin. So whenever there is a damage to the skin from a simple cut or from a simple wound, then at first there is a damage to the epidermis. Epidermis is basically made up of 5 layers, and each layer is made up of a tissue. The 5 layers of our epidermis is made up of, like, first layer is stratum corneum. Strata mean layers and cornea means cells. So basically in epidermis, the top layer is stratum corneum, which is made up of corneal type cells. The second layer is stratum lucidum, the third one is granulosum, fourth one is spinolosum, and the last one is basale. And these are, and we can see, like in cornea, these are the corneal cells. Lucidum, that lucidum which is only present in the palm and soles, and which provide the thick structure to the palm and soles. Granulosum, in which the granules are present. Spinolosum, in which the cells are spine shaped. And in basale, it's like a basal cells, and underlying the basale there are melanocytes which provide color to our epidermis. So basically this is our basic structure of the epidermis, and this one, from after the epidermis, the dermis gets started. Dermis is basically made up of connective tissue, which is fibroblast, neurons, blood vessels, and these are all connect with each other to provide the nutrients, oxygen to our epidermis, and for the regeneration of our epidermis and for the healing process of our wound. So whenever there is any damage to the skin, epidermis is basically the dead layers, and the dermis provide the healing chemicals or healing, like the essentials needed for the wound healing process, like fibroblasts, which join together again and form the basic integrity of the structure. The neurons, which are regenerative connective tissue that regenerates again and then provide the like communicate message again. The blood vessels, which regenerate through angiogenesis process, and then again provide blood to the epidermis of our skin. and underlying the dermis, there are fatty layer that provide the cushion and then puffy cushion and tensile strength to our deep down organs. And this muscle, which provide tensile strength and for the contraction and relaxation of our body, and underlying the muscles are the bones. So basically, this is the basic structure of the skin. And the skin is made up of different type of tissues. Like we have discussed, epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. The dermis is made up of connective tissue, and the third tissue is nervous tissue, which is basically the neurons present in the dermis. The fourth tissue is muscular tissue. We have discussed this example. Okay, so like in diabetic foot, we all know that diabetic patients suffer from diabetic neuropathy. So whenever there is a high level of glucose in our body, the neurons that communicate to the our periphery of the body usually gets damaged due to diabetic neuropathy. So in diabetic neuropathy, the nervous tissue gets damaged, and we will discuss it in detail in our upcoming chapters of diabetic foot ulcers. This is another example. It can be any of the diabetic foot ulcer, or in any of the scenario where the neurons and the blood vessels, micro blood vessels, transporting oxygen and blood to our periphery usually gets damaged due to any extreme level of the blood glucose. And whenever there is damage to the blood vessels or the neurons, the tissue starts depriving and ultimately lost its color, its tensile strength. So basically, the gangrenous tissue is a dead tissue. And in this kind of wound, there is a damage to the epithelial tissue, damage to the connective tissue, damage to the bone present in this big toe or second toe and third toe, and damage to the joints as well, and damage to the muscles. Basically, all type of tissues are damaged in this kind of the wound. So this is a basic lecture of our wound anatomy, and in a nutshell, to understand the wound anatomy, we need to remember that our body is made up of the cell, and different cells stack together and form a tissue. And in any or every type of wound, there is always a damage to the body tissue, and further, there are four type of tissues in our body. So whenever there is a damage to the skin, damage to the internal organ, damage to body due to any or every type of external or internal injury, then there is always a damage to the body, any kind of tissue, any kind of these four tissue. And we will discuss each tissue separately in our upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching this.